up here. Hi, it's John McGivern. I can't tell you how excited I am to be back inside the Cedarburg Performing Arts Center. Okay, I know I am the only one here, but that's what has to happen during these times. As I sit in this beautiful theater, this empty theater in the fall of 2020, I look back and I try to make sense of the last 6 months of our world. You know, since March, so much of what I knew as normal has changed. All of my performances, my live performances, whether they be public performances or my corporate performances, they've all been either canceled or delayed. My PBS series, Around the Corner with John McGivern, has been put on hold, and for the last 6 months, I have not heard one word when or if it will ever return. To be honest, this is the first time in 6 months that I have stepped foot in a theater. So a few weeks ago, I got a call from Kathleen here at the Cedarburg Performing Arts Center, and we shared our work lives, and Kathleen told me that the 2021 Visiting Artist Series had to be rethought and rescheduled, and we both came to the conclusion that we're not really sure when a live performance will happen again. And Kathleen told me that her and the board decided that they wanted to share something familiar with her incredible patrons and to those loyal subscribers and to those very giving sponsors. And I said, well, what is that that's familiar that you want to give? And she says, well, we're thinking that we want to give you. I said, me, and I laughed, and then I thought about it, and I thought it made such sense because since the early 2000s, I have appeared on that stage in front of huge audiences, full houses, over 11 times. I've been on that stage sharing my stories that when I tell these stories, I always believe that they are so incredibly specific to my life, but it turns out that they're specific to yours as well. I can't tell you how many times during these pandemic days that I have thought and I have hoped and I have prayed that when we reach the new normal, that new normal will resemble something familiar. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to step back on that stage and I'm going to share stories that will remind us of normal. And hopefully we will all find something that's familiar. I'm very excited to be back in this theater and back on that stage. And what I'm most excited about, to be honest with you, is that this is the first time in 6 months that I've ironed a shirt and put on a pair of hard-sole shoes. Very excited. So I wanted to have a sense of normal this summer for vacation. And normal for my partner Steve and I was going to a cottage up north for 2 weeks. 1 week in July and 1 week in August. And what felt normal is the fact that that's what we did every summer of my childhood. For 2 weeks in August, we went to a cottage up north because in our neighborhood, the Wasilewskis, they had a cottage on Lake Tomahawk way north. Yeah. The Jezusheks, they had a cottage in Paddock Lake, which was near Kenosha. And the McGiverns went to a resort. The Char-Char-Nade Resort, which stood for Charlie, Charlotte, and Nada, on Pine Lake, right near Wild Rose, between Wautoma and Wapaka, the Char-Char-Nade Resort. It was 2 cottages, 2 crappy little cottages that they called the resort. And the McGiverns, they spent their 2 weeks in the big cottage on top of the hill. The big cottage, which had 2 tiny bedrooms and a big porch with 6 bunks, 3 bunk beds, and a tiny little bathroom. It was my mom and dad and 6 kids and my grandmother. A tiny little bathroom that my dad had a rule about. Rule number 1, no number 2. No number 2? what are we supposed to do? You go down to the outhouse. Do you remember your first introduction to the outhouse? It was like, oh, what a cute little house. Let's go in. Oh my God, you've got to be kidding. A two-seater with all of that. To this day, I can still hold it for 2 weeks. So there we went, up to the Charnade Resort, to that cottage on top of the hill. And we walked down that twine and sort of brick path past the outhouse down to the beach. There at the beach was a cinder block boathouse that they turned into cottage number 2. And for the same 2 weeks that we were in cottage number 1 and cottage number 2 was my Uncle Jerry, my mom's only brother, and his wife, my Aunt Luann, and their 3 kids, Kathy, Kevin, and Dennis. 2 weeks for every summer of my childhood we spent with my cousins, my aunt and uncle, at Pine Lake at the Charnade Resort. And the Charnade Resort was a place of many childhood discoveries. Let me tell you, one of the first discoveries is that every morning my grandmother would wake up. My grandmother came with us, of course. She would wake up and she would begin breakfast. Breakfast for all of her grandkids. And she always brought her big black skillet with her. And she always wore this. At home, she called it her house coat. At the resort, she called it her duster. I guess duster is a resort wear term. She'd always have this on, and she would, in that big black skillet, fry up eggs and fry up potatoes and fry up tomatoes and fry up sausage and fry up bacon and put it all together and feed her 9 grandkids early in the morning up at the Charnade Resort. After breakfast, she would send us kids down to the beach, down to the pier. We're sitting on the pier as my mom and my Aunt Luann with their cups of coffee, and when we got down to the pier, down to the little dock, my mom would say, "Don't go in the water for an hour, otherwise you will die." We believed that as a kid. Yeah, what was going to happen was you're going to have a cramp and die right in the water. We would run up and down the dock, up and down that pier, and a half hour into us running up and down where my mom and Aunt Luann were trying to enjoy coffee, my mom would say, "Get in the water!" She was going to take her chances, is what she was going to do. My grandmother would clean up after that big fried breakfast, and she would come down after she did all of the dishes there in cottage number 1 on top of the hill, and she would come down in her duster, and she would sit on the pier closest to the beach, and she would put her feet into the inches of water on the pier, and she would roll up her duster so she could get some sun on her chalky white Irish legs. She'd sit there. What I remember was the summer when we were having such problems with those big black horse flies. Remember? If you had an inner tube in the water, they were attracted to that inner tube. If you could see them coming, you could kind of dodge out of their way. But if they ended up on your back without you seeing them, ow, that hurts. We were also having problems with these big bumblebees, those yellow-jacketed bumblebees that look so kind of lazy. They would fly towards you. You could almost whack them. They'd be like, oh. Well, there was my grandmother sitting on the dock with her duster rolled up. And I was playing in the water not far from her. From out of the corner of my eye, I saw my grandmother as I'm swimming towards my grandmother. As in slow motion, my grandmother gets up out of the water. And as in slow motion, this is what I saw. Completely naked. And I did the first thing my mind told me to do. And when it came up, I saw my grandmother running to that cottage number 2 with her duster in hand. It turned out that 2 bumblebees had flown up my grandmother's duster and stung her. It hurt her. It hurt me more because this was the first woman I had ever seen naked, and I discovered that summer that, well, I didn't really like it. You know, we all have families in our neighborhood growing up that become part of the fabric of our life. And one of those families for us were the Rayburns, Don and Elaine Rayburn. Don worked with my father, who was a bricklaying mason. He was a union mason along with my dad. They built buildings in downtown Milwaukee together. And Elaine was a registered nurse at Columbia Hospital. And Elaine was the go-to for my mom whenever her kids were sick. She would call Elaine, and Elaine would come right over. And years later, when we were all adults, my mother brought up at a Thanksgiving dinner, she brought up the fact that, you know, when you kids were young, you hardly ever got sick. And my brother Timmy said, you know why we didn't get sick? Because you call Elaine, and she'd come over, and no matter what was wrong, she'd give you an enema. I said, I have a toothache. Elaine Rayburn. They lived in the neighborhood, and they were like part of our family. They're the ones that would come over on a hot summer day and sit on the front porch and have a brandy old-fashioned sweet with my parents. They're the same folks that came over during Christmas and sat in our finished basement, and they brought over their own Tom and Jerry mix. They were part of the fabric of our life. And they just happened to have a cabin near Saxville on the Wolf River, not too far from Wild Rose, and between Wapaka and Watoma, not far from the Charnade Resort. So one day out of those 2 weeks every summer, they would come and spend the whole day with us at the resort. And the year I remember so clearly is the year that they came with their oldest daughter, Barbara. Barbara, who seemed so much older than me because she was our babysitter growing up. She came with her brand new husband. They had been married that summer, Clifford. Barbara and Clifford. Barbara was a cellist. Clifford was an accountant, a cellist, and an accountant. Think about it. They came and they sat on the pier with my Mom and Dad and Don and Elaine and Uncle Jerry and Aunt Luann, and they were drinking highballs starting at noon. And there towards 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a few highballs, and then into the afternoon, I watched Clifford get up off the dock in inches of water with his big, billowy, trunk-like swimsuit with that little string on top and that little pocket right here. And I watched Clifford as he came to the beach and sat on the beach with his feet in the water, with his big, billowy swim trunks. And as a kid, I thought, I hope the bees aren't bad. And as he sat there, I watched Barbara, who was a few cocktails into the afternoon, come and lay with her back on Clifford's chest. And I watched Clifford as I was swimming towards the pier. And I was watching them. I watched Clifford put his hands inside Barbara's one-piece Catalina swimsuit. And he was touching her boobs. I swam over to my mom. And I said to my mom, "Look, Mom, look. Look at what, honey? Look at Barbara and Clifford. He's touching her boobs. That's a sin." And my mom said, "No, it's not a sin for them." "Why is that not a sin for them?" And my mom said, "Because they're Lutheran." Yeah. I discovered that summer that Lutherans have a much easier life than us Catholics. A few years ago, we were at my sister's cottage on Taylor Lake there at the Chain of Lakes. And my two sisters, Colleen Mary Margaret and Maureen Mary Margaret, and my mom, we took a trip just down the road to the Charnade Resort just to see what happened. Just so you know, Charlie and Nate are long gone, and Charlotte has given up the resort business. We walked up to the top of the hill, and there was cabin number 1. Looked so the same. Then we made our way down that rock and root path down to the beach, and there it was, the cinder block boathouse and the pier where my grandmother had revealed it all. And the beach where Clifford and Barbara showed and shared their young Lutheran love. It all looked so the same, so much smaller than remembered, but the same nonetheless. A time capsule that, when opened up, revealed the true definition of the McGivern summer vacation. Which is why I wanted to feel normal this summer. 2 weeks up at a cottage not far from Wild Rose. This year, not a resort, but a cottage nonetheless. You know, and the fact that I wanted to feel normal had something to do with what we've all been through in the last 6 months. I talked about having a sense of familiar and having a sense of normal, and it just hasn't felt normal because, well, in the middle of all of the 6 months, we had to move my mom. My mom was born December 31st, 1927, and she hasn't moved that much in her life. She was raised in a third-floor walk-up apartment on the corner of Lisbon and Sherman Boulevard, right there by the Boulevard Inn, by the big statue. That's where she was raised. And then at the age of 20, she met my dad, that Irish guy from Stratford, Wisconsin. And these two Irish kids found each other and got married and bought a duplex on the east side of Milwaukee, 3131 North Bartlett Avenue. And my mother moved out of her parents' house, her parents' apartment there on Lisbon and Sherman Boulevard, and moved into that duplex where they raised their 6 kids. That was the same house that I was brought home from the hospital to. My father passed at a very early age, at the age of 54, and my mother kept that duplex and kept renting the upstairs of that duplex until she decided it was time for something easier. And since my two sisters, Colleen Mary Margaret and Maureen Mary Margaret, live in Cedarburg, Wisconsin, she bought a condo in Grafton, Wisconsin, a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom condo in Grafton. And we moved my mother out of 3131 North Bartlett Avenue, a place that no matter where I ever lived, even to this day when I think of home, that's the place I think of. We moved my mother up to that 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom condo where she lived for 10 years. 5 years ago, my mother moved again. This time she was moved into an independent living at the Catholic home back to the east side. And to get my mother back to the east side, it took a lot because she was aging some. She was 86 when she moved into the Catholic home, and she really didn't want to. She wanted to stay in her condo. But we brought her to the Catholic home, and we looked at the first apartment. She said, no, no. We went to the second apartment, and she said, no, I just don't. We went to the third apartment, and there, looking out the huge plate glass window, was the steeple of Saints Peter and Paul Church, the church that she spent most of her adult life in, the church that her kids were baptized in, the church where all of her kids went to grade school, the church where all of her kids were confirmed, the church where half of her kids were married. And she looked at that steeple and said, well, maybe. Well, the place opened up, and it was our job to move my mother again from the 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom condo in Grafton down to the independent living place at the Catholic home. I have apartments in downtown Milwaukee. They're corporate apartments. So what we did was we moved my mother into one of those corporate, fully furnished apartments so my mother didn't have to deal with any of the moving. And my 2 sisters and myself packed my mother up and moved her and set her up at her new independent living apartment. And my mother never saw anything come off the walls, and she never saw anything go on the walls. And we tried to make it look exactly like her 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom condo in Grafton. To move my mother, my 2 sisters went in there for 3 days. And the first day, my sister Colleen, who is a kind of, as my mom called her, Marge in charge, told me that I was to deal with the bedroom, that my sister Maureen would do the kitchen and my sister Colleen would do the office or the family room, the TV room. So I went to my mother's bedroom, and I had my boxes, and I opened up that first drawer of the bureau, and I looked, and it was, oh my Lord, it was my mom's delicates. Just didn't seem so delicate to me, just so you know. I put them in the box, and when I got to the bottom of that drawer, I looked, and underneath my mom's delicates, what did I find but my dad's teeth? Under my mom's delicates were my dad's teeth. My dad, who died in 1984, his teeth were still in my mom's underpants drawer. And I said to my sisters, get in here, look, Dad's teeth. And my sister Connie said, just throw that away. I said, I'm not throwing this away, because not only were my dad's teeth under my mom's underpants, just so you know, when my dad passed in 1984, for years of his life he was a bald guy, but one day, the late 70s, my father came home with a toupee. You know, he had that kind of hair that was just here, and he had 2 toupees, one when this got longer and one when this was shorter, and my dad was buried in the long toupee. And next to my dad's teeth, the short toupee. Dad's teeth and his hair. Later in life, my dad started collecting turquoise. He had turquoise rings and a big turquoise belt buckle and a turquoise bolo tie. Next to my dad's teeth, my dad's hair, my dad's turquoise. And I'm telling you, my dad, when he wore the teeth, and he wore the toupee, and he wore all the turquoise, he looked like a gay cowboy. So I said to my sisters, what should I do? Well, I got a hold of my mom, and I said, Mom, what do you want me to do with these teeth and that hair and the turquoise? And she said, what do you mean, what do I want you to do with it? I want you to put it back where you found it. I said, but Mom, it's Dad's teeth. And what are you ever going to do with that hair and that turquoise? And my mom said, you put that back. Those are my keepsakes. So when we moved my mom into the Catholic home, there in that top drawer, I put my dad's teeth and his toupee and the turquoise. Most of it. Because there's going to be a day when you will see me with a big turquoise belt buckle, and you're going to say, look, McGivern looks like a gay cowboy. wasn't he? So we moved my mother again. This time it was April 2nd, because on April 2nd, we lost our mom. She passed. 2 days before she passed, she was brilliant. She was great. But because of COVID, my mother did not die of COVID, but because of COVID, we did not see her through the month of March because they closed down the Catholic home. So we could only talk to her on the phone. And I talked to her on Monday, and she was great. On Tuesday, she said she didn't feel well. And on Wednesday, she passed. She died. I know she was 92 years old. I realize that, but you're never, ever ready for the passing of your parent, ever. And we had to wait to the middle of May to move my mother's stuff. So my sister, Marge in charge, Colleen, Mary, Margaret, and I went and did the whole thing. And I opened up my mother's bureau. And I took her delicates and put it into a box that we were going to throw. And underneath the box, underneath the delicates, I found my dad's teeth and his hair and his turquoise. And on the dresser were my mom's teeth. I packed them all and brought them to my house. I'm not going to put them in my delicate drawer. I put them close to my mom's ashes, which are now in my home, in our library, in a beautiful urn. My mom's final move was to my house. And now I have the keepsakes. So as I and my brothers and sisters have been dealing with my mom's passing since April, I've come to realize that so much of my material is based on my mom and my family. Like my mom is the central character of so many of my stories. So I'm going to suggest that the next time you see me on a bill that says John McGivern's Orphan Stories, show up. Okay?